Greetings, loyal listeners and new recruits. I'm Drew Deach.
I'm Travis Newton.
And this is Genre Vision. Every week, Travis and I review and recommend horror films, action movies, fantasy flicks, sci-fi cinema, and more. And this week, we are closing out Unconventional Vampires Month with George A. Romero's Martin. Before we do that, we want to remind everyone that Genre Vision is brought to you by our wonderful Patreon premium subscribers at patreon.com/genrevision. You can go there and become a premium subscriber for just $5 a month. Gives you unlimited access to our huge library of premium subscriber only content, including pre-show banter for Genre Vision, uncut episodes of our other show, Finflix, supplemental stuff for Third Time's the Charm, Genre Vision, a whole bunch of stuff basically. So if you want to help the show out, go to patreon.com/genrevision and become a premium subscriber, like our good friend Tommy, who sent us an email recently and kind of warmed our hearts for the week.
Thank you, Tommy, so much, and we appreciate your patronage and your continued support of the show.
Absolutely. And if you like what we do here, please consider going to the Apple Podcast Store and rating and reviewing the show. It's the best form of marketing we have for the show right now. If you do rate and review the show, we will read your review on the next episode. And I think we can jump into Martin, which Martin is a movie I've been kind of itching to revisit. I saw it way too young, like probably sometime in middle school, maybe early high school. I don't exactly remember.
That's real fucking young for this movie. I think I saw it in college.
Yeah, it was, it was during my most voracious learning period about horror, where any kind of library title from a notable horror filmmaker I was scooping up at my local video store. And Martin was one that always stuck out to me because it had a phenomenal box art and poster art, which is this razor blade with these vampire fangs kind of embossed into it. And it says made in USA, and this drop of blood is coming off of the fanged razor blade and drips down to the title Martin. It's a wonderfully evocative image that always stuck with me. But when I saw the movie when I was younger, I just was not of the right age and mindset to really meet it on its own terms. And so ever since then, I've wanted to revisit it. So when we decided on Unconventional Vampires Month, it was like, that's the one I really wanted to fight for. And, not that there was much fighting to be done, and now revisiting it, especially after Romero's passing, as far as the Romero movies that I've seen, which is the majority of them, I'm pretty comfortable in saying I think Martin might be Romero's saddest movie.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he's certainly had movies that have, been pretty nihilistic. The Crazies, for me, is like so satirical, but also so mean-spirited that it borders on nihilism for me. Obviously, Night of the Living Dead has got an extraordinarily sad ending, but this movie is about a situation that is way more relatable than anything in Night of the Living Dead. Night of the Living Dead is sort of this allegory, but Martin is less allegorical and way more realistic. Martin is the story of a young man, of course, named Martin, who we meet. He is traveling to live with this, I don't know if I would call him a distant family member. It says cousin Kuda or something like that, or Uncle Kuda. Anyway, he's being sent there because his family has essentially nearly disowned him, and they think this guy can fix him. The whole reason for all of this is complicated. There's some family history stuff that the movie gets into later, but they figure that this is the one way to save Martin or fix Martin is to have him go live with this guy Kuda.
Yeah, the basis of this being an unconventional vampire movie is that Martin, there is nothing supernatural going on about his vampirism. He attacks primarily women, he sedates them, and then kills them by cutting open their wrists with a razor blade and drinking the blood. And this family history that we learn about is that supposedly there's been a history of vampires in the family, but the movie is making a very direct and blatant argument about, is this something that's been clearly misdiagnosed as something supernatural and really is a mental illness.
Maybe. Or does Martin have some sort of mental illness that runs in the family? But then there's also this weird narrative that, you know, within the family, there is this curse. There's all this superstition. This is like, I don't know. And it's not an Orthodox Christian family. It's a very heavily Catholic family. And I'm not sure if they ever disclose where Martin's family is from or where Cuda is from. But, you know, thick European accent, deep Catholicism, lots of talk of the old country and, you know, this sort of more superstitious look at Catholicism. You know, there's a scene in the movie that talks, you know, distinctly from Cuda's perspective about what old men like him actually want from a priest. And they don't want this sort of newer, you know, hipper version of Catholicism. They want something that comes from the old country, something that is old world, something that is more orthodox. And that sort of juxtaposition of Catholic orthodoxy and superstition versus this sort of new American landscape and this young American kid is like great conflict, I thought.
Oh, there's a ton of great conflict, and we'll certainly get into that. But I guess we should start with the beginning of the movie where Martin is introduced. He's coming into Pittsburgh on a train, and this opening is his first attack on a woman and sets up the MO of the movie really, really well, in that we're going to see who Martin is, how he approaches these women, and more importantly, what's going on in Martin's head. Because when he spots the woman that's going to be his victim on the train and he attacks her, we have these cuts to these black and white vignettes basically that are taking place in Martin's head, which seem to be his perception of what's going on. And it's more traditionally vampiric with these beautiful women in flowing gowns who seem warm and accepting of his intrusion in their lives.
Well, yeah, they're lusting after him. Like that's the very clear difference between, you know, the reality and then what's happening in Martin's head, where Martin is this young, attractive man with this dark, slick back hair, this sexy vampire in his head. But the contrast in this first scene where we see this, you know, where we see this murder is that this woman, she's not, you know, in a, you know, dark candelabra lit room. She's this woman who comes out of her bathroom in her train cabin with a sleeping, you know, her face mask on, ready to go to bed in this awful green nightgown. Just this real person who is caught at a vulnerable moment. And, you know, we've seen Martin stalk his victim and go through this sort of ritual that he's been going through. You know, he'll have this kit that he takes out that's full of hypodermic needles and sedative and razor blades, and just it uses these extreme close-ups on his preparation to give us the sense that this is his routine. This is what he does every time he wants to kill a person. So once Martin actually intrudes into there and injects her with this sedative, it's not like a regular movie where somebody gets injected with a sedative and they go, and fall over. No, there is a struggle that feels like it's several minutes long, and it is very uncomfortable to watch.
I love the very clear decision to make these fantasies that Martin engages in contrast so starkly with the reality of what's actually happening. Like you said, we see this woman in his fantasy absolutely lusting after him in this beautiful flowing nightgown in black and white, cut to her in this gross sleeping gown with a face mask on. It's so clear that the movie's trying to hammer home in its very first sequence what its mission is in terms of what it wants to do with the vampire story and how it wants to pare away all of the allure of vampirism as far as, you know, its reality take. And that way it somewhat echoes elements of last week's movie, Chronos, in that the vampirism in this, the only time we see it at all being romanticized or enticing are when we see Martin's fantasies.
Right. Otherwise, the vampirism is really presented as the stark reality of this kid being a serial killer. And what's really odd is that, this movie came out in 1977. That's the same year Star Wars came out. The way that this is portrayed and the things that get actually spoken about, in regards to Martin's habitual killing and serial killing, it really eerily perceptive. Some of the things that Jeffrey Dahmer talked about when, he was arrested and sort of spoke about wanting to have his victims and control his victims and, be able to spend sort of as much time as he wanted with these people with really no worry about this other person's agency or consent. That is the sort of driving sexual need behind somebody like Jeffrey Dahmer, but it's very much the same with Martin. This habitual need to kill, and it's clearly a sexual impulse, but it is also clear with Martin that there is a sexual dysfunction. There is sort of a fear and a prudish sort of way or a bashful sort of way that he looks at this stuff.
Well, later in the movie, he develops this relationship with a radio host that he calls into their show and calls himself the Count and talks about what it's like to be a real vampire. And he talks about how all the stuff you see in the movies isn't real. You can't hypnotize somebody and make them do what you want them to do. Mm-hmm. You can't do that. And that's clearly a fantasy and a desire for Martin. He wants to be able to shape other people to his will. And the way that he's able to do that, specifically with women, is to sedate them and kill them, because he doesn't fully do any kind of penetrative act with these women in this opening scene with the woman in the train.
Well, it's kind of unclear. I mean, he lays with her in the bed naked, and I kind of assumed that this was going to be sort of, that penetrative act. I hate to be so blunt about it, but this is the kind of stuff the movie wants you to think about. I had kind of assumed that was going on, and he talks about, I've never really done the sexy stuff with anyone who's awake. And you think, yeah, this kid's doing horrible things to people.
It's never stated straight out. I always assumed that Martin's shyness never got to that point with his victims, because later in the movie he will engage in a consensual relationship.
Sure. But I mean, the way he talks to the guy on the radio where he's like, I've never done the sexy stuff with anybody awake. I can't wait to try it with somebody who's awake. It's like,
Well, it's also, I don't know exactly what his definition of the sexy stuff, as he calls it, how far that goes, but
right. It's clear that there's like a really deep shame attached to all this that is preventing him from being so outright, and being able to discuss these things explicitly and exactly what he wants to say. In a lot of ways, Martin is stunted emotionally, even though he believes he's 84 years old. I think that's his, the delusional age he states he is, but he's still very much a boy in so many ways, even younger than his age.
Well, clearly that there's a lot of interesting facets to Martin's character. Maybe we'll get back to that, but I do want to focus on some other elements of the movie, because I think this is a great showcase for Romero as a filmmaker, as not somebody who's super showy, but who was really assured as a director, especially when Martin gets to Pittsburgh and he meets Cousin Cuda, who's wearing the wonderful ice cream suit.
Yeah, he's looking like Colonel Sanders.
And
Nosferatu. I am Cuda. You come to my house, and you will be Nosferatu. You stay in the attic, and I'll regard you as Nosferatu.
The accent changes with every line.
It does.
Which, we get these big, expansive shots of Pittsburgh and eventually this town, Braddock, that is clearly fallen on hard times. There's so much dialogue about how people are moving away from this town, that there's no decent work here anymore. And Romero is transplanting the gothicness of the vampire tale into an industrial American setting.
Yeah, it's a really cool lo-fi aesthetic that he works with, because, at this point, Romero had already cemented himself as a really strong stylist. But when you watch this movie, you get the sense that Romero was, paring things back very, very particularly to achieve a lo-fi sort of grunge look for everything. And it almost embodies the idea of what like an amateur film would be. I mean, he had already made Night of the Living Dead and Season of the Witch and The Crazies and so on and so on. This was like a particular step back to make it look not only like it was low budget, but also like it was done to be exploitative. And, your theory on this was like, well, this was kind of supposed to play in porn theaters.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly has that aesthetic, and there's elements in the movie that they would be able to sell to those markets. This was shot on 16 millimeter, so it's just naturally going to have a grainier, grungier look to it.
And it's not just grainy, man. It's like really hazy and, full of like psychedelic color, and it's a really unique lo-fi look. I dig it a lot.
Yeah, it looks like what I think a lot of people assume a grindhouse movie's supposed to look like in terms of the grunginess and again that 16 millimeter sheen of it all. But there's more to it than just that kind of look. Romero, I don't think he ever got the credit for being a really good director in terms of framing, and more than any other movie I can think of, I think Martin is a really great showcase of his talent for that, because one of the most important things about Martin is the title character played by John Amplas. And John Amplas, he is so perfectly cast in this movie, and Romero knew that he would be able to shoot Amplas in close-up and get gold out of this kid.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he is so wonderful in close-up. His eyes are so expressive. He has such a unique look. Really is, I think, the best possible outcome to star in this movie. He has this really disarming, oddly enough. I mean, we know the character does horrible things and has, monstrous tendencies, but like we want to sympathize with him in an odd cognitive dissonance sort of way. We see this innocence of this actor, and we want to believe that Martin has some sort of innocence in him. This is one of the driving conflicts of the movie, is that dissonance that is created in the viewer's own head when they look at John Amplas and go, this poor kid. And we look at this horrible environment that he is raised in and all these horrible expectations that are placed upon him by his family. It's like, this is awful and sad. And of course, the kid is a monster and has these compulsions to do these awful things, but we can't help but feel for him in some way.
Well, I think the movie does a good job of putting forth a really complicated discussion about nature versus nurture, because we are told that Martin has grown up in this family structure that believes in vampires and believes he's one of them, and who knows what that kind of onus has instilled in him during his formative years, to the point where he seems to believe, I don't know if he's being jokey about it when he says he's 84, but there is clearly this mental illness that goes on that he's aware of. He knows there's a problem with him, that this isn't something that he's passing off as okay and doesn't see that it's a problem. That's so sad, and there's so much of the movie that reinforces this sadness. For example, Martin starts working for Kuda's market, just kind of goods and stuff.
It's like a specialty European goods market, where they'll have, cured meats and that kind of stuff.
Right. And he starts doing deliveries, and he starts delivering to this one woman who I feel like she is such a key element in the movie, because she is the only other character that seems to specifically echo Martin's loneliness.
Mm-hmm.
And they end up becoming entwined in a relationship, but it's not a relationship of love or compassion. It is just one of mutual loneliness.
Makes it even sadder.
It's so sad. It was something I don't think I was cognizant of when I originally saw the movie, and this time it really hit me in a way. And there's so many, because even though the movie's called Martin and it does primarily focus on Martin, there are a lot of other characters surrounding him that reinforce what's going on in the movie. His Kuda's granddaughter, who's played by Romero's real life wife.
Real life wife. We say that a lot.
Yes. She is dating this guy played by real life Tom Savini, who doesn't look a day older than he does today.
The only difference is that he grew a mustache.
It's it. It's the only thing. Otherwise, he looks great. So she's very supportive of Martin. She understands that she's grown up with all of this same vampire legend stuff in the family and hates it and sympathizes for Martin and wants to help him. But she eventually, at a point, says that she's sticking with Tom Savini's character just as a means to get out of the town. She says, I know we're not going to last. He's just my way out.
Yeah.
That's so fucking, it's so sad.
It's really a bunch of people at the end of their rope, like in a dying town. And I love that sense of place about it. It really is one of the most remarkable things about the film. There is really a sense of place and culture. This is probably Romero's most Italian movie in a lot of ways. It's a lot of talk of sort of old world Catholicism. And then, seeing Tom Savini as this young guy, it's like he could have been in a Rocky movie. It's like, I feel like Joe Spinell's just around the corner.
He's peeking over.
Yeah.
No, I agree is that there's definitely a lot of that. And that sadness with Kuda's granddaughter. Martin says, or she says to Martin, I'll write you and I'll, check up and try and help you. And Martin says directly to her, it's like, no, you won't. You'll forget. Everybody forgets. And that's what happens. Like he says later, like she stopped writing me. It's such a depressing movie, but there's this other thread going on. And I think that one of the reasons this has now become one of my favorite of Romero's movies is that Romero was a cynical guy. You look at his filmography, you look at the things that he was interested in, and I don't say this judgmentally, he was a very cynical person as far as his outlook on a lot of aspects on life.
There's a pessimistic bent to most of his things. Yeah.
Well, and I think that a lot of his movies, sometimes that can come off as just being pessimistic or maybe even a little edgy for edginess sake. I'm not saying that that's necessarily good or bad, but Martin is one of the few, maybe only movies in his filmography where I think Romero is deeply exploring his own cynicism.
There is not only cynicism, but like the reason the movie is so sad is because there is an actual sense of sentimentality to it. Not in the sense that anything in the movie is maudlin. Like the closest Romero ever got to maudlin was with Monkey Shines, which is a great movie, even though it's quite corny. But there is no real sense of corniness in this, even though, Martin has some goofy ideas about like, performing magic tricks and stuff like that. But really, all it is to tie in the thematics of, the fantasy and the delusion matched up with the superstition and the religion and magic. It's all just, magical thinking that Romero likes to talk about. I don't get the sense that Romero is a particularly religious guy from this movie.
No,
in fact, there's a lot of cynicism directed at religion in the film.
Well, he's directly equating religion with magic in the movie, and because vampires are traditionally creatures that are associated with very specific Christian and Catholic imagery.
Did you say Catholic?
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Catholic.
Catholic. Where'd that come from? The fact that Romero has this very contentious relationship with religion is presented in the movie through Martin feeling that there is no magic in the world. He performs this little cutting your finger off trick at the dinner table one night, and he explains how the trick is done and says that there's no real magic in the world, which is an incredibly sad, cynical statement. Later in the movie, Martin basically puts on a show for Kuda where he embraces all of the tropes of vampires in movies, where he's got a big black cape and the fangs, and there's mist rolling out on the ground.
Let's get the white face paint and all that.
Everything. And Kuda buys into it. He's got his cross up and doing all of this, and Martin's just laughing in his face. and shows him. He says, it's all just makeup. It's a costume. None of this is real. And it's a wonderful pointed argument to make with a vampire movie, to say that this isn't real. All of this stuff that vampires are associated with is tied up in Christianity, which is a dying belief. And that's even more that's even more driven home by when we see the Braddock local Catholic church is shot in this decaying warehouse.
Oh yeah, it's this horrible, like awful condemned building. And like when they first cut to like the interior of the building and they're having a church service, and of course Romero plays the priest, which is great. He's a wonderful priest. You know, they're holding it in this horribly shitty space, and I'm going, what's going on here? And of course Romero is like, okay, first thing, you know, we have to acknowledge why the church is so shitty. And I sent you a message like, what a clever way of getting around having to shoot a church scene in an abandoned warehouse.
Yeah, and it ended up reinforcing this idea of, yes, this community is decaying, and their belief structure, this symbol of their belief structure, their church, is dying from the inside. That's clever, low budget genre filmmaking thinking. And I love that. And like you said, when we get to hear Cuda kind of speak to Romero's priest character and say that this is what us old people want. We want you to believe in demons and exorcisms and the old ways. We don't want anything progressive. And Romero's priest character is clearly trying to ride the line and be very cordial with Cuda, but also be like, I don't believe in any of this.
Sure. Well, I mean, he talks about The Exorcist, the film, you know, which would have come out, I think, 4 years prior. And of course, he's like, yeah, I saw The Exorcist. I loved it. You know, but he's clearly treating this as entertainment and not as something that, you know, somebody like Cuda would take so seriously.
Well, which leads to the next scene where Cuda has some, because Romero's priest character says, you should talk to this other older priest who says he's, you know, performed exorcisms and that he saw the movie and said they got everything wrong. Cut to Cuda getting that priest to come in and perform an exorcism on Martin. And Martin just buries himself in the corner of this room looking so pissed off that this is going on.
I just love that he just gets up and leaves halfway through. It's pretty great. And the priest just keeps going.
It's funny, but it's another refutation of this kind of structure. And while, like I say, a lot of that is present in Romero's movies, these feelings about certain institutions of power being totally worthless, this is the first movie that I think, maybe one of the only movies in his filmography, that really analyzes that, yeah, this is what I think. That doesn't mean I'm happy about it. It makes me feel sad and alone.
Sure. And it's what happens with Martin is, you know, he, even though he says, you know, magic doesn't exist and all this sort of stuff, and nothing about this magical stuff is real, he also believes himself to be a vampire, and he may well believe himself to be 84 years old. He also may believe he has lived these sort of scenarios, you know, that we witness in black and white that almost at some points in the film read like flashbacks. You know, not just romanticizing the current scene in fantasy. They do read like something that has previously happened to him.
Well, yes, because he has a memory of an exorcism. One of the black or whatever, one of the black and white sequences is that of an exorcism earlier in the movie that then comes back up again when Cuda and the older priest come to perform the exorcism on him. He recalls that. While I think the movie is being very deliberate in stating that there is nothing supernatural going on with Martin. It's all about his headspace and what he believes in and what has been instilled in him through his upbringing, that there is something really doomed about him.
Yeah, there is this sort of line between delusion and belief in the film that keeps moving. And it's clearly one of the themes that Romero wanted to talk about in making Martin. It's like, where does belief stop and delusion start? This is all sort of peripheral stuff that happens, you know, branching out from the center of the film. There's this horrifying attack sequence that, you know, all of this stuff is taking place around. And it's like, this is, you know, the premise executed at its most pure. Like the opening attack scene is, of course, extraordinarily uncomfortable to watch, but like this attack sequence in the center of the film is really, I think, a tremendously well, I mean, it's tremendously troubling, but it's like supposed to be troubling. It really is impressive filmmaking from Romero, but my God. Ugh.
Oh, this is the horror centerpiece of the movie. This is because the rest of the movie isn't, I don't think, plays out in typical horror movie fashion. And it might be one of the reasons why Martin isn't as strongly embraced in Romero's filmography, is because it is a horror movie, but it doesn't carry itself that way for the majority of its running time, except the opening sequence and then this centerpiece where he's staked out a woman from earlier where he was pretending to be a deaf and mute and comes to her door. He sees that she's going to be alone, breaks into the house, again, has this fantasy of chasing her through some gothic castle where she's carrying a candelabra and stuff. And when he breaks into the room, she's there with some other guy.
She's having an affair. So this dude is not her husband.
Well, and I love the performance in this moment of the guy thinks that this is her husband. Mm-hmm. And he's going, let's talk about this. There's no need to get mad. And her response of, I don't know him, is so genuinely unnerving and gross. It's wonderful. It's wonderfully effective. And then there's a big kind of cat and mouse scene where he ends up shooting up the guy with the sedative, and she's trying to call somebody on the phone. And so Martin gets on the other end of the phone and is pressing numbers to stop her from calling out. Incredibly dated sequence by today's standards, but I love the way it plays out.
Yeah, well, she doesn't want to call 911 because she doesn't want to reveal that she's been having an affair, which is like, okay. One would think that would go out the window, but
priorities.
Yeah, but I mean, he's already messing with her on the phone and like trying to prevent her from calling out. And then she's trying to call somebody else, but she's panicking and she can't remember the number. And of course, this is the days before contacts. She would have had to sift through the Rolodex, which of course, I get the feeling like if she had to do that in this film, she would have dropped the Rolodex and then it all would have lit on fire for no apparent reason. It's just that kind of sequence where everything goes wrong. And in that way, it's kind of masterfully orchestrated. Like, just like before, Martin injects somebody with his, sedative, and it takes a few minutes for them to go down. This is not the instant movie sedative that we see so often. Like, this guy gets shot in the back with this stuff, and then he is running around like a big burly bear for a few minutes, and Martin is having to avoid the guy until like he finally starts to slow down, which at that point he starts crawling around. I said in my notes, like Leo DiCaprio on Quaaludes.
Well, that
from, Wolf of Wall Street.
And when the guy finally gets outside and he's completely doped up and Martin decides to kill him, and Martin is just screaming at him, "You weren't supposed to be there." Mm-hmm. And he grabs like a branch off of a nearby tree and stabs the guy in the neck. It's a great little Tom Savini easy neck stab effect. And then he eventually does go back and sedates the woman. He says, "I'm not going to have to hurt you now because of him, because I killed that guy. So I got that out of my system." It is a very effective sequence that I wish got talked about more in Romero's filmography. But I think, again, coming back to it, is that this isn't really scratching that particular horror itch for a lot of people. I think it's closer to something like Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, or where it's a character piece, and a really sad, disturbing character piece at that.
Right. The rawness of it is alarming, though, where it's not presented, in the traditional sort of sense of a horror stalking scene or a home invasion scene. It's not presented in these sort of usual rhythms and shot compositions that we're used to seeing. It's handled entirely differently, which makes it pretty disarming, I think. Like, it's a pretty disturbing sequence, but it's also blackly funny. Like all the horrible wallpaper in the house is hilarious. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's just because it was shot in 76 or 75, but in somebody's real house, clearly, because this is not the kind of movie that could afford to build a house set. Man, it is like a slapstick comedy of errors at some points where just everything that can go wrong goes wrong for everybody in the scene at the same time.
Yeah, it's which is great conflict. Yeah, just a great interior conflict in a specific scene. I do want to mention the score by Donald Rubinstein. The score in this, I think it's not the kind of score that's going to stick out or have a memorable melody or anything, but it reinforces that kind of doom and sadness. There's a part of the track where we're just seeing shots of Cuda and Martin walking through Pittsburgh, walking through Braddock, and there's some vocalizing from a woman on the track, and it just feels like it immediately set me up to be depressed.
Well, it's just this like melancholy art house mood stuff where he's just walking around Pittsburgh killing time with his uncle, who he doesn't even, barely knows and certainly doesn't like. This scene only exists to set up their sort of melancholy and awful dynamic. And then they get back on the train and they go to Braddock. So it's just a minute or two of them just like walking around in sort of pretty abandoned urban spaces with sad music, and then they get back on the train. There is a lot of that kind of stuff in the film just for mood.
But it's effective.
Oh, yeah. I think for a film this lo-fi, to have that kind of mood is, it speaks to just how good of a stylist that Romero was. And I think you and I saw some comparisons with this film to porn. And that some people feel like some of the scenarios are kind of porny. And it's true. I mean, it does occasionally play like, a knowing parody, or at least a knowing use of some of those pornography scene tropes where it's like, oh, a delivery man shows up at the house and the woman is lonely and, wants the delivery man to come inside. You know what I mean? It's that kind of bullshit.
Yeah, it's a scummy movie in terms of its veneer. I don't think it's a scummy movie in terms of its actual essence.
No, not at heart, but like that aesthetic is grime.
Yes. But we do have to talk about the woman that Martin ends up in this kind of relationship with,
Mrs. Santini,
and how she is just the saddest looking person I might have seen in a film all year. She just looks so downtrodden.
But beautiful and tragic. Like, we know Martin is a tragedy. Like, from early on in the film, you get the sense that this is going to be a tragedy. And she is that sort of tragic, beautiful woman in the film. And, I mean, I still love that they do some funny things where, like, they're driving around together and Martin opens up her glove compartment to see a box of tampons in there, which is just like, oops. Yeah.
Well, it reinforces his embarrassment and shyness about sex and women. And she's very open and accepting, and clearly that kind of maternal figure for Martin.
But Martin is still, I think, fundamentally not able to deal with women as people, as, whole persons with agency and their own will.
No, like we said, he outright states that when calling into the radio show. So eventually the movie is winding down with people leaving the town and all of this happening, and Martin goes over to Mrs. Santini's house. I can't remember, does he go over there with the intention to kill her?
I'm not sure, and I don't believe so, but there is a point in the film where he does appear to be having this, this, of course, melancholy and sad relationship with Mrs. Santini, but it's satisfying something for him that he clearly wasn't getting before, where it might be just that slightly more positive relationship or more human relationship with a woman. And he calls into the radio show to say, like, I've thought about my urges and they're different now. Like, I'll see the kind of woman that I used to want to kill before, and I don't quite get that same urge. Like, I still get shaky and I want the urge to kill, but I don't have that kind of same tie to lust like it did before. Like, there's something else that's been satisfied. Like, there's, you get the sense in that moment that there is potential for Martin to maybe not be this horrible, awful killer anymore. And then the movie dashes all those hopes. If there is hope, the movie dashes it.
Because he gets there and finds her in the bathtub. She slit her wrist and committed suicide, which immediately echoes the tools that Martin has used throughout the movie to kill his victims.
Yeah, the safety razors or the razor blades, whatever they are.
So then he is in bed and wakes up, and Cuda is standing above him and drives a stake through his chest.
Yeah, in a scene that almost seems like an art house, like, was that real kind of moment? But no, the movie wants you to know that happened. Because, like, as the credits play, Cuda has quite clearly buried Martin in the backyard.
Well, and it's stated very directly. He does this. It's genuinely shocking when it happens. I can see people viewing it ironically, but for me, it was shocking and tragic.
I had forgotten about it. I gasped. I really legitimately gasped when it happened.
Well, and Cuda says that you think I wouldn't know that it was you that killed Mrs. Santini, which is even more tragic, where it's like, no, he didn't kill her. It's the one woman he hasn't killed in the movie. And it's incredibly violent and gory, a simple but incredibly effective effect. And then the credits roll over Cuda finishing up a grave in the backyard and putting his little white cross on top of it, while the radio DJ host starts talking about, where's the Count? Everybody's calling in wondering who the Count was and where is he? Is he out there? And all these other callers calling in that people in some way cared about Martin. It's so sad, to a point where it's the kind of movie that it almost got to that Spike Jonze level where I'm like, I really liked this. This is so well done. I don't know if I ever want to watch it again.
No, I mean, it's a real bummer. And I don't want to make it seem like, you know, this is going to be the saddest movie you ever see, or I don't want to warn anybody away from watching this movie, because I think it's good, and I do think people should see it if they're at all uninterested in this idea of unconventional vampire films, or if they're like a Romero completist where they want to understand Romero's filmography better. Certainly if you're a Romero completist, you got to see Martin, and if you haven't done so, you're missing out. It's quite a good film. Is it sad? Absolutely, because it is one of the rare films that takes a look at a monstrous man who has a horrible relationship with women and does horrible things to them, and yet the movie manages to make you feel something for him, and also manages to make the argument that there are systems in place, there are systemic problems that have contributed to Martin being who he is. I think it treads a fine line in being able to say that kind of stuff. You know, we want to, there's of course, you know, the social justice push these days is wanted to reinforce that people are ultimately responsible for what they do. And of course, you know, if we want to treat people with the kind of respect and agency, you know, regardless of sex or what have you, people need to take responsibility for the actions they have in order to treat somebody with full agency. But this movie talks about institutional problems and talks about how trauma and superstition and baggage is passed down, which we all know on some level to be true.
I'll state right out that this became one of my absolute favorite Romero films after watching it. It's one that I feel needs a really great stateside release, that needs tender love and care, because I think this is one of his best, most well-rounded movies. And so much of that, I mean, we touched on it, but I think John Amplas's performance is absolutely perfect. I think that Romero's filmmaking is some of the best in his career, and I think it has a lot on its mind and is willing to be incredibly introspective. Like, you're talking about these systemic issues, and that's certainly part of the movie's thesis, but it's also really looking inside the heart of a cynic, that Martin is this person who looks at the world very cynically. It's not saying that viewpoint is wrong. In fact, in the majority of Romero's filmmaking, and certainly in Martin, it's saying that no, the things you think and feel about the world are right, but that's really, really sad. And is there anything we can do to save ourselves from the doom of that sadness? And Martin ultimately takes a very tragic route and snuffs out any chance at hope. But I think it's one that I hope gets some rediscovery and reappraisal, because I really think it's up there with the best of Romero's filmography.
Absolutely agreed on that point. But what does it say about unconventional vampires and or vampirism in cinema or in general?
Well, I mean, since this is closing out Unconventional Vampires Month, looking back, I think what's been kind of interesting, and maybe this is our fault with the movies we chose, is even though we picked what we considered unconventional vampire movies, I think we hit on a lot of movies that explored common tenets of vampirism just in kind of obtuse ways.
Right, which I think speaks to our cultural fascination with vampires, talking about, vampirism as a metaphor for addiction, vampirism as a metaphor for temptation. And of course, temptation and addiction are very closely intertwined thematically. Like, if there was one movie I wish we could have done, like if there was another week where we could have done this, I think we should have done a Twilight film, because their sort of puritanical approach to seeing vampirism as being all about temptation and the rejection of temptation is kind of fascinating.
Oh, I'm deeply fascinated by those movies' approach to what they find alluring about vampirism and how they want to change their lore to reinforce the specific themes and wish fulfillment that they want. Because it's so fascinating. We did Kronos and Martin back to back. Both of these were Catholic movies. I did not expect that. And it's like, yeah, that is, Catholicism is something that is wrapped up directly with vampirism. Even in Life Force, they had to end things in a big Gothic church.
Yep.
I think out of all the movies we ended up doing, Dr. Sleep kind of ended up being the one that strayed the furthest from typical vampire ideas.
Sure, yeah, it wasn't about religion, but the whole AA thing is like higher power, like that's way, way more reinforced in the book.
Well, but thematically, like you're saying, it still landed on common things that vampires are used for in fiction, like talking about addiction or craving youth or time or life.
Mm-hmm.
Strangely, I think the movie that stuck out the most for me is From Dusk Till Dawn, because like I said in that episode, the vampires, they're very fun and very cool, but they are just they could have been any monster.
I agree. Yeah, they really could have been just about anything, because the movie isn't really about vampirism on a thematic level at all. Like, there's nothing about, the Gecko brothers, for instance, that echoes anything about vampirism. Yeah, it really is just sort of a surface execution of that premise. And that simplicity is part of why I think From Dusk Till Dawn is so enjoyable, because it's just so unfettered and uncluttered by any sort of intellectual aspirations.
Sure. And ending on Martin, as far as its specifics with Unconventional Vampires, I think that vampires as characters for the majority of mainstream fiction, even if they're villains, they are somewhat often displayed as tragic figures. Going all the way back to Dracula.
Sure.
And Martin is a equally tragic figure, and though the means of his vampirism are stripped down and made realistic, he still is in that mold. And I think a lot of vampire stories are tragedies. I think vampirism and tragedy seem to go hand in hand in a lot of cases.
Sure. Well, and romance and tragedy go hand in hand, I think, just as frequently. Take a look at the works of William Shakespeare or, all of literature. And of course, vampires are the most literary of the classic monsters, I think.
Yeah.
We can certainly talk about Frankenstein's monster being a literary monster, because it, of course, comes from a very, 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 very famous piece of classic literature. But I think the vampire, of course, has a better representation throughout all of literature, because the idea is just so, permanent. And in so many cultures, so many different cultures all over the world had ideas about what a vampire was to them. And, Martin specifically talks about the old world sort of European idea about what vampires are. And that is, we being a colony from European countries, or a colony of a European country, it's like, well, that's where our legends come from. But I really would have liked to have seen, I think, a vampire film that doesn't explore those same things. Like, what does a Chinese vampire film look like? Or what is, Japanese vampire lore? Or, that is like, for me, the next step is like, let's take a look at vampire lore that doesn't use these same ingredients. Like, that's what I would love to step outside as the next step for unconventional vampires.
Yeah, maybe that's something we'll revisit in another theme month, because I certainly would. I think this was an interesting start to this exploration, and I'd like to find more unconventional vampires, because I think it proves how malleable the idea of a vampire can be to tell whatever story you want to tell. And I think there's a lot more out there that we've only kind of barely scraped the surface of this month.
Agreed. Yeah. And I think this is one of our more fascinating topics. I think we've had more fun topics, like, Scarence was definitely my favorite topic this year that we covered, because the 4 movies we did for that were just a fucking blast. But yeah, this has definitely been one of the more interesting ones to explore, at least from a thematic standpoint.
Well, let's head over to the shelf, where we pick a movie that might act as a good pairing or substitute for our main topic. And as always, we want to encourage you, loyal listeners, to go to genrevision.com and comment on the post for this episode with your own shelf picks. Travis, what are you going to pull off the shelf for Martin?
I am pulling off a film by Darren Aronofsky called Black Swan. This has an urban sort of decay grunge aesthetic that I found really fascinating, even though it's set in the world of high art. It's set in the world of ballet. So this story that is a lot of different things. It's a story about somebody who wants to, capitalize upon their youth, and then contrasts it with a character who feels that their youth and their talent or their ability or their ability to have other people desire them is lost. Like, it definitely treats youth like currency, which is something that we've seen in other vampire films this month. But the gradual decay into hallucinatory and monstrous imagery mixed with this sort of grunge aesthetic, I think makes it sort of akin to Martin in a lot of ways. The psychosexual component to Black Swan is, of course, fascinating. And then there are similar themes of pressures passed down from one generation to the next. Barbara Hershey plays the mother of the main character in the film, and so much of the film's central arc is determined about, the kind of pressures that Nina, the protagonist, like the kind of pressures her mom puts on her to be a performer.
Yeah, I have not revisited Black Swan since I saw it in the theater. It was incredibly impacting when I saw it, and it's one that I will revisit someday, but it's also one that I feel I'll be very interested to see how I've grown with that movie.
I think it's great, and I think it's probably one of my favorite films of the decade. I'm willing to say that. Anyway, what, sir, are you pulling off the shelf?
Well, I'm going to go a little obvious here. I was going to pull off the shelf another Romero movie, Bruiser, because that's one of his other kind of character pieces. But I recently rewatched that, and I can't really recommend it. I don't think it's very good. It's a great idea and a good cast, but it's just not great. So I'll go with Maniac, and I'm going to go with the remake from director Frank Calhoun and produced by Alexander Aja. Yeah. Catholic. I like William Lustig's Maniac. I do. It's also got Tom Savini in it, which is a connection to Martin, and great effects. It's a deserved cult grungy classic. But I would call Frank Calhoun's Maniac one of my favorite movies of the decade. It takes that idea of putting the audience literally in the head of a monster, of a serial killer, and following them around as they murder women and scalp them, and you see their hallucinations and delusions and all this kind of stuff. It's an incredible experience, and it's one that is deliberately off-putting to the majority of people that will see it.
Certainly, and it does, again, present its central character in a way that can be viewed as sometimes pitiful and pathetic, and that you do feel awful for this person and that they have to exist.
It's they are a tragic figure.
For sure.
And for as little as you actually see him in the movie, I think Elijah Wood's performance sells that.
Sure.
It's a different spin on what, like we were saying, Joe Spinell, to mention him again. Joe Spinell's take was much of like, this is a schlubby. It makes me think of Norman Bates in the novel cycle to Norman Bates in the cycle.
Catholic.
It makes me think of Norman Bates in the movie Psycho and Norman Bates in the novel Psycho, where in the novel, Norman Bates is this kind of schlubby, balding, lump of a guy. And then in the movie, he's beautiful Anthony Perkins. That same kind of thing happens in the Maniac remake, where you went from Joe Spinell to Elijah Wood. And I think they both give really good performances in their respective movies. But Elijah Wood, I think, is able to nail that very tragic take on the character in that version exceptionally well. Yeah, Maniac is one that I've revisited a couple times and am just astounded exists. And like I said, it's not going to be for a lot of people because they're probably not going to be able to stomach literally being in the eyes of a murderer for the entire runtime. But it's effective. It's one of the good ones. Agreed.
Anyway, we have shelf picks from the listeners.
From last week's episode on Kronos, we had a couple shelf picks. Loyal listener Pale Fire recommended Hellraiser 1 and 2. And that was because of their same kind of lore building. I adore the original Hellraiser, and I really, really like Hellraiser 2.
I like Hellraiser 2 a lot as well, even though I think you and I both recognized its shortcomings in our review of it a couple years back.
Yes, we did do an episode on Hellraiser 2, and it's still a movie I like, and it's a low bar, but it's definitely the best Hellraiser sequel.
By a long shot, yeah.
But I mean, the first Hellraiser is just, it's a deserved classic. It's an
stone cold classic.
Astounding film. DT Grizzler, their shelf pick was Pee-wee's Big Adventure. And because he said that he loves watching directors' first early films, you see the seeds of things that become their signature style and what they could pull off even without crazy money at their disposal, which is certainly the case for both Kronos and Pee-wee's Big Adventure. And Stephen Nesbella, his shelf pick was Stephen King's The Night Flyer, a movie that deals with obsession, a reporter played by Miguel Ferrer who follows a black plane that he believes is flown by a vampire who travels across the country feeding on people. And he says the vampire looks amazing, horribly disgusting, removing all romanticism of vampires, much like Kronos. I am so mad that we did not think to do The Night Flyer, because I dig that.
I nearly picked Night Flyer as one of my shelf picks, but then I remembered, I don't like that movie very much.
See, I'm on the other end. I dig that movie quite a bit.
See, I love the vampire in it. Like, I'm with Steven Nasbella. I think the vampire design and the vampire effects in that film are great. And of course, I love Miguel Ferrer, but I don't have fond memories of the rest of that movie.
Well, it's a scummy movie because its lead character is this horrible, like weekly world news type reporter who,
he's a total like shithead, unethical reporter, which is potentially like a fascinating protagonist, but the rest of the movie never made a huge impression on me.
I've always liked it, and I know I revisited it a couple years ago. I think it was shortly after Miguel Ferrer's passing a few years ago, and I've always loved him. And yeah, Night Flyer, it's because I think it was like a HBO or Showtime movie or something, direct to video. Maybe it had a small theatrical release, but it was not notable at all.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and it's a great story. Like the idea behind the story is fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, let's go on to some currently consuming.
Nom, 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 nom.
Travis, what's been on your plate?
I watched a movie. Surprise, surprise. It's called The Dead Center, and this is a new independent horror film that stars somebody that some of you might have heard of, a little guy named Shane Carruth, who was the writer and director of movies like Primer and Upstream Color. This was directed by a guy named Billy Sinise or Sinise. He wrote it as well. Independent kind of horror mystery where Shane Carruth plays a doctor in a psych ward in a hospital. In the beginning of the film, we get this incredible drone shot of an ambulance coming into a hospital, and it delivers this dead body. It's this guy's dead body, and shortly after it's wheeled into the morgue, this guy's body gets up and walks away and goes and hides in one of the hospital rooms and is just laying in bed. They go find this guy. You know, it's not like somebody from the morgue goes and finds him and says, "Oh, there you are. I was wondering where you went." No, it was another one of the staff that says, "Who are you? What are you doing in here?" And the guy can't talk. So they figure, oh, it's this guy. He's nonverbal. He's naked. He's laying in this bed, doesn't know where he's gone. I guess we'll put him in the psych ward. And so this doctor, played by Shane Carruth, starts to, try to talk to this guy and see if he can get the guy to open up. And the mystery that starts to unfold, I don't know, for me, it didn't get explored to its most satisfactory limits, but the movie's really well put together. And I always like seeing Shane Carruth act because he's an extraordinarily naturalistic actor. He doesn't swing for the fences in anything for his performances, but his naturalism I find really, really fascinating.
He's got big Macon Blair energy.
Yes, for sure. Oh, he doesn't have those Macon Blair eyes.
No, but I think they have similar approaches to acting.
I agree. So I'd recommend it for fans of indie horror, but just be aware that, there's a premise at play here that doesn't really get explored to the limits that we normally see in standard genre fare. Like there's still a lot of questions kind of left over by the time the movie ends. I won't spoil anything, specific about that, but it plays in familiar territory. So I guess it's not all that different. It's not like it's a complete and total, like, what the hell were they even doing? It's, definitely recommendable for people who like that sort of slightly more realistic edge to their horror movies. Like, it's at its fundamental heart a medical drama. Like, it takes place in a hospital, and a lot of the stuff that happens in the hospital has this sheen and air of realism around it that you don't normally get in movies like this. So I was impressed enough with it. I'd recommend it. Anyway, what have you been currently consuming?
Well, there's a new season of Rick and Morty that just started up. It's on its 4th season. And Rick and Morty is a show that I absolutely adore, but it's another one of those shows that has cultivated a toxic fandom.
Sure.
And I kind of have to remove myself from a lot of the love of the show because it just attracts really, really awful fans. And I think a lot of it, especially the more and more it's become merchandised and has kind of gotten out there, I think a lot of people take away the wrong things from it, like people loving Rick. It's
sure.
I think that's...
Well, he's so quotable.
He's so quotable, and he is obviously the instigator of the majority of what goes on in the show, and he's basically a god as a character, which is great from a writing standpoint because they find really interesting ways to explore that kind of stuff. And it means that almost the best of his conflict has to be interior. And there's been 2 episodes out as of this recording. The first one's great because it takes a shot at Rick and Morty fans, where Rick ends up uploading his consciousness to various... He keeps dying in the episode, so his consciousness uploads to clones in alternate universes. And he ends up in an alternate universe that's run by fascists. And it turns out that the majority of the alternate universes he goes to are run by fascists. And one of them being a fascist Morty who says that I want us to go on classic Rick and Morty adventures and all this stuff and keeps yelling at Rick whenever he wants to do something. And Rick pointedly says, it'd be a lot easier for me to do this if you didn't only tell me what you don't like.
Yeah.
Which is like, hey-o. And then to which, of course, fascist Morty goes, well, I like Mr. Meeseeks. Rick's like, okay, here, we got a Meeseeks box. Let's pull him out. So that's really funny. The actual idea, the A plot of that episode is Morty gets this crystal that when you hold it, you can see all the myriad ways you'll die. And he sees a future where he's dying as an old man with Jessica over him in bed saying, I love you, Morty. And so he he starts doing everything. He holds the crystal and he'll take whatever path is leading him to that outcome, which ends up in him becoming a horrible godlike monster. That episode was pretty good. The second episode was, I think, a little bit better because it separated Rick and Morty, and Rick had a solo adventure where it's revealed that he's a shy pooper, and he has this toilet that's on this planet somewhere that's overlooking this amazing sci-fi landscape where he goes to poop. And then he finds out that someone else has used his toilet. So his plot is trying to discover who this person is that used his toilet and why. And it ends up being a really emotional kind of kick in the gut for Rick as a character, establishing like he's actually a really lonely person. And what he's done to cultivate this loneliness about him. I think the show is great because the show is incredibly sentimental, which is what weirds me out about its fans, because it's like this show wears its heart on its sleeve a lot. And I think people get wrapped up in the more cynical and ironic elements of the show. And it seems like this season the first episode ended with Rick and Morty saying like, sometimes maybe we'll do classic Rick and Morty adventures. Sometimes maybe we'll do something different. Maybe you and I won't be together. We're going to try different things. Rick and Morty trying different things for 100 years, that stuff. So, I like all that stuff. I think they're splitting the season up. Like they're doing 5 episodes now and then 5 episodes after the winter break. I'm not exactly sure, but it's always been a really good show, especially from a writing standpoint. And after 2 episodes, I definitely think that's still there. They've got a damn good writer's room. So I think that'll close out Currently Consuming, and we'll end things with our
Comment of the Week,
which comes from loyal listener DT Grizzler, who said, I'd never gotten around to seeing Kronos, so I checked it out. Which, it still would amaze me that our little show would inspire anybody to watch any movie for the first time. That's like the biggest compliment we could ever get.
Well, I mean, this is part of the reason we started doing this is like when you and I were reading film blogs coming up, this would inspire us to watch movies we'd never seen. And we got something out of that community aspect of doing sort of a watch along, you know what I mean? And watching these movies, what we felt like in sync with others that either, gave us new viewpoints or held viewpoints that were similar to our own. It's, this community sense is powerful. Even though it's a small community that we may have at Genre Vision, it's a tight one. And I love the idea of knowing that just because we're watching these movies, that you all are watching them too, warms my heart. And hopefully next year we're going to be able to do some stuff where you all will be deciding what movies that we're going to do. So.
We'll see. Yeah, we love that sense of community, and we only want to foster that more and more. So, well, next week we'll be back at the movie theater with Knives Out, the Rian Johnson whodunit. I love that they've just leaned into that in the marketing. Just calling it a whodunit. It's wonderful.
Martha, what's a whodunit? What?
So we hope you enjoyed Unconventional Vampires Month, and you'll be back next week for Knives Out. As always, we want to thank you so much for listening. I'm Drew Deitch.
I'm Travis Newton.
And we'll see you next week.
Right here on Genre Vision. Drew Deitch and Travis Newton, who done it? I done it.
You done it. Who done it?
I made this.
Who's vanity
That's
card?
That's the end of every X-Files episode.
That's their vanity card, yeah.
I made this.